Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin.
The mountain road twisted through bare December trees, like a scar across the Pennsylvania landscape. Calla Braddock gripped the steering wheel of her old Toyota pickup, her knuckles white against the worn leather. 5 years. 5 years since she'd driven this route from Asheville back to Pine Hollow. The truck's heater struggled against the bitter cold seeping through the window seals. She'd driven through the night, stopping only for gas and bitter coffee that tasted like regret. Her phone sat silent on the passenger seat, next to a manila envelope that had changed everything. The radio crackled with Christmas music from a station in Scranton. Silent Night played through the static, and Calla reached over to turn it off. She'd heard enough Silent Nights. Tonight would be anything but silent. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman who'd grown harder over the past 5 years. The soft curves of her face had sharpened into angles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes were chosen for function rather than fashion work boots, jeans with paint stains, a flannel shirt that had seen too many construction sites. She looked like what she'd become. Someone who built things with her own hands because she'd learned not to trust anyone else to do it right. Pine Hollow appeared around the final bend like a postcard from someone else's life. The same cluster of houses huddled against the Pocono foothills. The same white church steeple piercing the gray sky. The same narrow main street lined with shops that barely survived on tourist dollars and stubborn pride. The town looked smaller than she remembered, somehow diminished by distance and time. The hardware store still displayed the same faded American flag. The post office still had the same cracked sidewalk out front. Mrs. Chen's restaurant had closed down, replaced by a store selling hunting supplies and lottery tickets. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Calla had changed most of all. The 26-year-old who'd left this place broken and betrayed had been replaced by someone harder, someone who'd learned to rely only on herself. 5 years of building custom furniture had given her calloused hands and a steady income. 5 years of living alone had taught her the difference between solitude and loneliness. 5 years of planning had brought her back here with evidence instead of tears. Calla pulled into the gas station at the edge of town and cut the engine. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. One missed call from Delamay. Her cousin's text waited. They're all there. Big crowd. Perfect timing. Perfect. Calla almost laughed. Nothing about this day would be perfect, but it would be final. She drove through the residential streets, past houses where neighbors used to wave. Mrs. Henderson's blue colonial still needed new shutters. The Kowalski kids had grown up and moved away, leaving their swings set to rust in the backyard. Time had moved forward here, but carefully, reluctantly, the Braddock house sat at the end of Maple Street like it always had, but it looked different now. Smaller somehow. The white paint had fresh coats that gleamed too bright. New landscaping replaced her mother's wild flower gardens with neat, controlled rows of evergreen shrubs. Even the mailbox was different black metal instead of the weathered wood post her mother had painted with wildflowers every spring. Even the house had been scrubbed of Marnie's fingerprints. Calla remembered helping her mother plant those flower gardens when she was 12. They'd spent a whole Saturday choosing seeds from the garden center, Marnie reading the packets aloud and explaining which flowers would bloom when. The secret, Marnie had said, her hands dark with soil, is to plant things that come back every year. Perennials. That way, even when you're not here to tend them, they remember where they belong. The perennials were gone now, replaced by shrubs that required no memory and no care. Cars filled the driveway and lined the street. License plates from 3 states. Reed always did love his Christmas crowds, his chance to play the generous patriarch. The same people came every year, church friends, distant relatives, neighbors who enjoyed the free food and open bar. They'd gather around Reed's table, drink his wine, and listen to his stories about being a pillar of the community. Today, that performance would cost him everything. Calla parked across the street and sat in the truck for a moment, studying the house where she'd grown up. The living room windows glowed warm yellow. Shadows moved behind the curtains. Laughter carried on the winter air, the sound of people who belonged somewhere that she belonged there once. Her phone buzzed. Della May again. You sure about this? Calla typed back. 5 years too late to back out now. She grabbed the manila envelope and walked across the street. Her boots crunched on the salt-scattered sidewalk. The front porch still had the same rocking chairs, but they looked uncomfortable now, like decorations instead of places where people actually Saturday. The wreath on the front door was perfect. Store-bought perfect, with a red velvet bough that had never seen weather. Her mother would have made her own from pine boughs gathered in the woods behind the house, with holly berries and maybe a cardinal's feather if she found one. Calla knocked 3 times. Firm, steady knocks that carried across the winter air. Footsteps approached. Heavy, familiar. Reed had always walked like he owned whatever ground he stood on. The door opened. Reed Braddock stood in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He'd aged more than 5 years, should account for. His dark hair had gone completely gray at the temples, and new lines mapped the corners of his eyes. He wore a red sweater she didn't recognize and dress pants instead of the jeans he used to favor on Christmas morning. But his posture was the same straight-backed, defensive, ready for a fight he was sure he could win. Behind him, the living room buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. The smell of prime rib and red wine drifted out, along with warmth that stopped at the threshold. She could hear Mayor Hale's distinctive laugh, Pastor Arlen's booming voice telling a story, the clink of silverware against china, the sounds of people who belonged somewhere. You were told not to come here. His voice carried the authority he'd learned from 20 years of running the church board. The same tone he'd used when she was 16 and had missed curfew, when she was 18 and had questioned his decision to sell her mother's jewelry, when she was 22 and had dared to ask about her trust fund. Calla met his eyes without flinching. 5 years ago, that tone would have made her defensive, apologetic, eager to explain herself. Now it just reminded her why she was here. By who? The question hung in the cold air between them. Reed's jaw tightened as he realized she wasn't going to back down or apologize or make this easy for him. You are not our family anymore. Reed's words came out measured, practiced, like he'd rehearsed them. Go away. The finality in his voice might have hurt once, might have sent her back to her truck with tears in her eyes and regret in her chest. But Calla had spent 5 years learning that some wounds only heal when you cauterize them. Over his shoulder, Calla caught sight of Laureen standing by the mantelpiece. Her stepmother had maintained the same warm smile that had fooled everyone for years, but her eyes held satisfaction that she didn't bother to hide. Laureen had one, and she wanted Calla to see it. The manila envelope felt heavy in Calla's hands. She could end this conversation right here, right now. She could show Reed the power of attorney her mother had signed but he'd never filed. She could watch his face change when he realized she knew about the trust fund theft. She could destroy him on his own doorstep in front of his perfect Christmas gathering. Instead, she nodded once. Okay. Reed's eyebrows lifted slightly. He'd expected a fight, tears, some kind of scene that would let him play the victim afterward. Her calm acceptance threw him off balance. Calla turned around and walked back to her truck with steady steps. She didn't hurry. She didn't look back. She got in, started the engine, and drove to the end of the street before pulling over. Her hands were steady now as she dialed Della May's number. It's confirmed, she said when her cousin answered. Run it. 3 hours earlier, Nashville. Tennessee. The memory hit Calla as she drove away from Maple Street. 3 months ago, sitting in the cramped office of her custom furniture workshop in Asheville, when everything changed, the workshop occupied half of an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. She'd rented it cheap because the roof leaked and the heating system hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. But it had good natural light and enough space for her equipment, and the rent was low enough that she could afford it even during slow months. She'd been sanding a dining table when the mail arrived. Custom work for a family in Charlotte cherry wood with hand-carved legs that had taken her 3 weeks to perfect. The kind of work that paid well but required patience and precision. The package had arrived on a Tuesday with no return address. Plain brown paper, her name and address written in block letters. Inside, a note in Della May's careful handwriting. Found this in Aunt Marnie's things. Thought you should see it. The legal documents were yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved in a manila folder that still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender perfume. Power of attorney forms, financial records, and a copy of her mother's, well, that didn't match what Reed had shown her after the funeral. This version left everything to Calla, with Reed as executor, only not owner. The house, the small savings account, even the family furniture that had been passed down through 3 generations of women who'd known how to make a home from nothing. But the real shock came in the medical records. Marnie had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 6 months before she'd married Reed. Not after like he'd always claimed. She'd known she was dying when she'd drawn up these papers, trying to protect her daughter's future from a stepfather she'd loved, but never fully trusted. Calla had spent the next week researching, making calls, connecting dots that should have been obvious years ago. A paralegal at the county courthouse had helped her understand the timeline. A records clerk had shown her how to trace financial transactions. An old friend of her mother's had provided the missing piece recordings of phone calls that painted a picture of systematic manipulation and theft. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and completely legal. Reed had violated his fiduciary duty as executor. He'd diverted funds meant for Calla into accounts he shared with Lorene. He'd sold property that should have been held in trust and used the proceeds for his own benefit. He'd committed felony theft, and he'd done it with his wife's signature on every document. 2 years earlier, Pine Hollow, the fight that ended everything had started over something small. Calla, home from community college for spring break, had questioned why her trust fund statements weren't coming to the house anymore. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done homework as a child, where her mother had taught her to roll pie crust and braid bread dough. Lorene had been at the stove, making breakfast with the kind of elaborate precision that turned simple tasks into performances. "Your mother's debts were bigger than we realized," Reed had said, not meeting her eyes. He'd been reading the newspaper, or pretending to, his coffee growing cold beside him. The medical bills. "We had to make some difficult decisions." The phrase difficult decisions had become Reed's favorite euphemism. Difficult decisions about selling Marnie's jewelry. Difficult decisions about converting the trust fund. Difficult decisions about what Calla needed to know and when she needed to know it. But Lorene had been wearing new jewelry that day, a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the morning light as she stirred scrambled eggs. And the kitchen had been remodeled with granite counters that cost more than Calla's entire semester tuition. "What kind of debts?" Calla had asked. "Mom had insurance through the school district." "Insurance doesn't cover everything, honey." Lorene's voice had carried the patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children. There were experimental treatments, special medications, private nurses. Your father did everything he could to save her. The word father always sounded wrong coming from Lorene. Reed had never adopted Calla, never tried to replace her biological father who died when she was 8. He'd been a stepfather, a good one mostly, but the relationship had always carried the acknowledgement that it was built on choice rather than blood, until Lorene had arrived and started rewriting the family history. "I just want to understand where the money went," Calla had pressed. "The trust fund was supposed to be protected." That's when Reed's patience had snapped. He'd slammed the newspaper down on the table, making the coffee cups jump. "You think I stole from you?" His voice had carried the wounded tone he'd perfected in church board meetings, the one that made questioning him seem like a personal attack. "After everything I've done? After I've raised you like my own daughter since you were 8 years old?" "I didn't say you stole anything. I just want to see the records." "Lorene's right about you." The words had come out sharp and final. "Your grief has made you paranoid and ungrateful. Maybe you need some time away from this family to figure out what you really want. The conversation had ended there, but the damage was done. Within a week, Reed had found reasons to criticize everything Calla did. She was too loud, too messy, too demanding. She didn't appreciate the sacrifices he'd made. She didn't respect Lorraine's efforts to be a good stepmother. She was, according to Reed and Lorraine's carefully constructed narrative, impossible to live with. Calla had packed that night and left the next morning. 22 years old, with $300 in her checking account and a truck that needed a new transmission. She'd driven to Asheville because it was far enough away to feel like freedom and close enough that she could afford the gas. She'd never ask for help again. She'd learned not to need it. Present day, Pine Hollow. Calla drove through the center of town to kill time. Main Street looked the same as always, decorated with garland and twinkling lights that the Merchants Association strung up every year. The hardware store still had the same faded awning. The diner still advertised world-famous pie in hand-painted letters on the window. She parked outside the old drugstore and called Della Mae. "How long until the emails go out?" Calla asked. 20 minutes. I've got them scheduled to hit every address at exactly 3 o'clock. Della Mae's voice carried satisfaction that mirrored what Calla felt in her chest. The Dropbox link is ready. Everything's uploaded and organized. Financial records, voice recordings, the original will, even the medical timeline. Voice recordings. Remember when Lorraine used to call the church office and complain about you? Mrs. Patterson in the secretary's office always recorded those calls for liability reasons. She saved them all these years. Calla closed her eyes. Of course Lorraine had been building her case even then, making sure there were witnesses to Calla's supposed problems. "You sure about this?" Della Mae asked. "Once those emails go out, there's no taking it back. They made their choice 5 years ago. They made it again this morning." Calla watched a family walk past on the sidewalk, heading toward Reed Street with a covered dish and wrapped presents. "I'm just making sure everyone knows what they're really celebrating." "Calla, what he did to you, what they both did, it's not just wrong. It's criminal. Theft of trust funds, fraud, financial elder abuse. You could have him arrested. Prison would be too easy. He'd be a victim there. Poor Reed, who made mistakes because of grief. This way, he has to live with the consequences every day in the town where he built his reputation." Della Mae was quiet for a moment. "You've changed." "I grew up." Calla started the truck again. "I'll see you soon." 5 years ago, after the funeral had been everything Marnie would have hated. Too formal, too controlled, filled with people who'd barely known her but showed up because Reed was important in town. Lorraine had chosen the flowers, white lilies instead of the wildflowers Marnie loved. The pastor had given a generic sermon about God's plan that could have applied to anyone. Calla had sat in the front pew between Reed and Lorraine, wearing a black dress she'd bought the night before with money she'd borrowed from Della Mae. Everything felt wrong, like watching someone else's life through thick glass. After the service, during the reception at the church hall, Lorraine had cornered her by the dessert table. "I know this is hard for you," Lorraine had said, her voice pitched low and caring for anyone who might be listening. "But you need to understand that your father and I are trying to build something here. A stable life, a respectable family. He's not my father. He's the only father you've had since you were 8 years old. And he's struggling right now, trying to figure out how to move forward." Lorraine's hand had landed on Calla's arm, warm and confiding. "The last thing he needs is more conflict. I'm not causing conflict. Aren't you? Questioning his decisions about the estate? Making him feel guilty about finding happiness again?" Lorraine's smile had never wavered, but her grip tightened. "Maybe you should think about what's best for everyone here." That conversation had been the beginning of the end, though Calla hadn't understood it at the time. Looking back now, she could see how carefully Lorraine had laid the groundwork. Every interaction designed to make Calla look unstable, jealous, grief-stricken in all the wrong ways. Present-day, Pine Hollow Community Center. Calla drove past the community center where her mother had volunteered every Tuesday, reading to preschoolers and helping with craft projects. Marnie had believed in building things up, in making life better for people who needed help. She would have been horrified by what Calla was about to do. But Marnie was dead, and the people who were supposed to protect her daughter had stolen her legacy instead. Calla's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Pastor Arlen. I think we should talk." She deleted it without responding. The time for talking had ended 5 years ago when Reed had chosen Lorraine's version of the truth over his stepdaughter's questions. Another text, this one from Mayor Lucinda Hale. "Calla, whatever you think you know, there might be explanations. Can we meet before this gets out of hand? Too late for explanations." The mayor had been at every church board meeting where Reed had built his reputation as the devoted widower who'd taken in an ungrateful stepdaughter. She'd nodded along when Reed had talked about Calla's issues and inability to accept his new happiness. The truth was simpler than any of them wanted to admit. Reed had found it easier to believe Lorraine's lies than to deal with his own guilt about remarrying so quickly after his wife's death. And everyone else had found it easier to believe in Reed's version of events than to question why a grieving young woman would suddenly become so difficult. Calla pulled into the parking lot of the community center and sat in the truck as the clock on the dashboard clicked over to 2:58 p.m. I end 2 minutes. Every person at Reed's Christmas dinner would receive an email with a Dropbox link titled, "This is what your hosts did." They'd see the financial records showing how Reed had diverted Calla's trust fund. They'd read the medical timeline proving Marnie had been dying when she'd signed the original will. They'd hear Lorraine's voice on the recorded calls. Spinning lies about Calla's behavior and mental state, they'd see 15 years of trust and reputation crumble in the space of a few mouse clicks. Calla's phone rang. Reed's number. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, Reed. What have you done?" His voice cracked with fury and fear. "What have you sent to these people?" "The truth. Something you should have tried 5 years ago." "Calla, I don't know what lies you've been told, but..." "I wasn't told anything. I found it myself. County records, medical files, bank statements. All public information if you know where to look." Calla kept her voice level, matter of fact. "Did you think I'd never find out? Or did you just hope I'd died somewhere so you wouldn't have to worry about it?" "That's not. I never..." Reed's composure cracked. "You don't understand. After your mother died, I was lost. Lorraine helped me through the darkest time of my life. Some of the financial decisions I made weren't perfect, but they weren't criminal. They were survival." "Whose survival?" "Because it wasn't mine. I gave you a home. I raised you. I loved you like my own daughter. You stole my inheritance and threw me away when I asked questions. That's not love, Reed. That's convenience." The line went quiet except for Reed's ragged breathing. "Come back to the house," he said finally. "We can talk about this. Work something out. But you need to stop this attack on my family." "Your family?" Calla almost laughed. "I was your family once. Where was this urge to work things out when I was 22 and homeless?" "You weren't homeless. You chose to leave." "I chose to leave because you made it clear I wasn't welcome unless I kept my mouth shut about what happened to my mother's estate." "Calla, put the truck in drive. I'm done keeping my mouth shut." She hung up and drove back toward Maple Street. The real show was about to begin. The cars were still parked along Maple Street when Calla returned, but something had changed. The laughter from inside the house had stopped. Through the living room windows, she could see people huddled around their phones, faces lit by the blue glow of screens. Calla parked across the street again and watched the house. A few guests had moved out onto the front porch despite the cold, talking in urgent whispers. She recognized Pastor Arlen's profile, his hand gesturing as he spoke to Mayor Hale. Both of them kept glancing at their phones. Her own phone buzzed constantly now. Texts from numbers she didn't recognize, calls from people who'd cut her out of their lives years ago. She ignored them all. At exactly 3:30, she got out of the truck and walked back to the house. This time, she didn't go to the front door. Instead, she walked around to the back patio, where the sliding glass door had been left unlocked for guests who wanted to smoke or get some air. The patio door opened into the kitchen, where Della May stood washing dishes with methodical precision. Steam rose from the sink, and the smell of soap mixed with the lingering aroma of prime rib and roasted vegetables that no one would eat. Cala's cousin looked up when she heard the door slide open. Della May had always been the steady one in the family, the cousin who remembered birthdays and kept track of family feuds and knew where all the bodies were buried. She was 2 years younger than Cala, but had always seemed older, more grounded in the realities of small-town life. "They're not taking it well," Della May said quietly, her voice barely audible over the running water. Reed's been pacing like a caged animal, back and forth from the living room to the kitchen to his office upstairs. Keeps checking his phone like he's expecting someone to call and tell him this is all a mistake. What about Laureen? Locked herself in the downstairs bathroom 20 minutes ago and hasn't come out. Della May rinsed a plate and set it in the drying rack with careful precision. I can hear her in there, though, talking to someone on the phone, probably calling every friend she has, trying to do damage control. What about the guests? Reading everything, passing phones around like they're sharing family photos, except nobody's smiling. Della May dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face Cala fully. I heard Mayor Hale on a call with someone from the district attorney's office. She was using words like investigation and formal complaint. Cala felt a flutter of satisfaction in her chest. She'd hoped the evidence would be compelling, but she hadn't dared to expect such immediate results. Pastor Arlen tried to get everyone to put their phones away and pray, Della May continued, but nobody's listening to him. Hard to pray your way out of bank records and voice recordings. Any of them defending Reed. Jody tried it first. Said there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding. But then she saw the medical timeline showing when your mom was really diagnosed, and she just stopped talking. Been sitting by the Christmas tree ever since, staring at her hands. Della May glanced toward the living room, where they could hear the low murmur of tense conversations. You sure you want to do this? Once you walk out there, there's no taking it back. These people have known Reed for 20 years. Some of them will forgive him eventually, find ways to excuse what he did, but they'll never forgive you for exposing it. Cala considered her cousin's words. Pine Hollow was a small town with a long memory for grudges. By destroying Reed's reputation, she was also burning her own bridges back to the community where she'd grown up. But those bridges had been burned 5 years ago when Reed had chosen Laureen's lies over his stepdaughter's questions. Cala was just making the destruction visible. I'm not looking for forgiveness, she said. I'm looking for justice. Della May nodded slowly. Then you'd better get in there. Show's about to start. Cala nodded and walked through the kitchen toward the living room. The house felt different now, charged with tension and whispered accusations. The warm glow of Christmas morning had turned cold and harsh. She stepped into the living room doorway and surveyed the scene. The Christmas tree still sparkled in the corner, surrounded by discarded wrapping paper and open gifts that nobody cared about anymore. The dining room table was set for dinner, but the food sat untouched as guests clustered in small groups, sharing phones and speaking in voices too low to hear clearly. Reed stood by the mantelpiece, his face gray and haggard. He'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His red Christmas sweater looked garish now, like a costume he'd forgotten he was wearing. When he saw Cala, his whole body went rigid. You made it public, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Conversations stopped as heads turned toward her, so I figured I'd bring my receipts to match. Get out. Reed's voice shook with rage and desperation. Get out of my house. Funny thing about that. Calla stepped further into the room, and the guests parted around her like she was radioactive. According to my mother's actual will, the one you never bothered to file, this should have been my house 5 years ago. Pastor Arlen stepped forward, his hands raised in a peacekeeping gesture. Calla, I understand you're upset, but maybe we could discuss this privately. Work through whatever misunderstandings. Calla pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo of a bank statement. This shows a withdrawal of $47,000 from my trust fund account in September 2019. The same month Reed and Lorene bought their new car. Which part is the misunderstanding? The pastor's face went pale. He'd been in the room when Reed had announced the car purchase, had listened to Reed joke about finally being able to afford something nice after years of medical bills and financial stress. This is a setup, Reed said, his voice rising to fill the uncomfortable silence. She's manipulating all of you, just like she tried to manipulate me after Marnie died. She's sick. She needs help. But his words fell flat in a room full of people staring at documented evidence on their phone screens. Bank records didn't lie. Medical timelines didn't manipulate. Voice recordings spoke for themselves. Calla walked to the center of the room, next to the coffee table where someone had set down a plate of untouched cookies shaped like Christmas trees. I wanted nothing from you, she said, looking directly at Reed. I wanted the truth. You gave me the lie, and now it's yours to live in. Calla. Jody Braddock, Reed's sister, spoke up from her position near the Christmas tree. She'd been like an aunt to Calla growing up, always ready with hugs and homemade cookies when Calla's world felt unstable. Honey, I know you're hurting, but destroying your family won't heal the pain. My family. Calla turned to face Jody, and the older woman stepped back at the coldness in her eyes. Where was my family when I was sleeping in my truck because I couldn't afford rent? Where was my family when I was working 3 jobs to pay for community college because my trust fund had mysteriously disappeared? We didn't know, Jody whispered. Reed said you'd cut off contact because you couldn't handle him remarrying. He said you needed space to work through your grief. He said a lot of things. Calla's voice carried no emotion now, just flat statement of fact. The question is why all of you found it easier to believe his version than to ask why a 22-year-old would suddenly choose to be homeless and alone. Mayor Hale cleared her throat. If what you're alleging is true, this is a legal matter. It needs to be handled through proper channels. I agree. Calla reached into her jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, which is why I'm serving notice of civil litigation for theft of trust funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. She set the envelope on the coffee table next to the Christmas cookies. Reed stared at it like it was a snake. You can't prove any of this in court. I don't have to prove it. The documents prove themselves. Your signature on the withdrawal forms. Lorene's name on the joint accounts. The power of attorney you never filed because it would have made you executor instead of owner. Calla's voice never wavered. The only thing I have to prove is damages, and my empty bank account does that pretty effectively. The bathroom door opened, and Lorene emerged with her makeup carefully reapplied and her smile firmly back in place. She surveyed the room like a hostess who'd been momentarily delayed, as if she could still salvage the situation through sheer force of will. I'm sorry everyone's Christmas has been disrupted by this situation, she said, her voice pitched to carry sympathy and regret. Obviously, Calla is dealing with some very painful emotions, and sometimes grief can make us see things that aren't really there. Grief. Calla turned to face her stepmother for the first time. Is that what you call it when someone discovers their inheritance was stolen? I call it a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Lorene's smile never faltered, but something desperate flickered in her eyes. Your father made some difficult financial decisions during a very stressful time, but calling it theft is accurate. Calla pulled out her phone again and tapped the screen. Lorraine's voice filled the room, tinny but clear through the phone's speaker. She's been acting stranger and stranger since Reed and I got engaged. Yesterday, she accused me of trying to steal her mother's jewelry. I'm honestly worried about her mental state. Reed doesn't want to admit it, but I think she might need professional help. The recording was dated 6 months before Reed had kicked Calla out of the house. In the background, they could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice. I'll make a note in the file. Has she been violent at all? Not yet, but she's so angry all the time. And paranoid. She keeps asking questions about money and legal documents, like she thinks we're trying to cheat her somehow. Calla stopped the recording. Except I was right, wasn't I? You were trying to cheat me. You'd already started cheating me. Lorraine's smile finally cracked. That conversation was taken out of context. I was concerned about you. We both were. Concerned enough to record my private conversations. We didn't. Your son did. Calla looked around the room until she spotted Avery near the dining room doorway. Lorraine's 24-year-old son had always been weak rather than malicious, but weakness could be just as destructive as cruelty. You knew about the trust fund accounts, didn't you, Avery? You saw the paperwork when your mother asked you to help with the banking. Avery's face went white. I didn't think they were real. I thought she was exaggerating about the amounts. $50,000 seemed like an exaggeration. I thought maybe it was like a savings account or something, not a real trust fund. Avery's voice broke. Mom said it was complicated because of the medical bills and the estate stuff. It wasn't complicated. It was theft. Calla turned back to address the room. They didn't just take my money. They spent 5 years making sure everyone in town believed I was the problem. Unstable, ungrateful, a burden that Reed had heroically tried to carry until he couldn't anymore. Pastor Arlen made another attempt at mediation. Perhaps we could step back and pray for guidance. Ask God to help us find a path forward that serves everyone's needs. God didn't steal my inheritance, Calla said flatly. People did. People who knew better and chose to do it anyway because they thought I was too young and too alone to fight back. The room had gone completely silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The clock had belonged to Calla's grandmother, another piece of family history that should have been hers but had been absorbed into Reed and Lorraine's version of home. Mayor Hale was the first to break. She stood up from her chair near the fireplace and gathered her purse and coat. If any of this is substantiated, I have a legal obligation to report it to the appropriate authorities, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Reed, Lorraine, you should probably contact attorneys. She walked toward the front door without looking back. Her departure seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the other guests in place. Pastor Arlen followed next, pausing only to squeeze Reed's shoulder. I'll be praying for all of you, he said, but his voice carried disappointment along with the sympathy the Keebler family left together, whispering among themselves. Then Hank and Willa Kershaw, Marnie's old friends, who couldn't meet anyone's eyes as they gathered their coats point one by one. The guests filtered out until only family remained. Reed, Lorraine, Avery, Jody, Delamay, and Calla. The living room felt cavernous without the buffer of other people. Jody was crying quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I can't believe this is happening. Not at Christmas. Not to our family. It happened 5 years ago, Calla said. You're just finding out about it now. But why didn't you come to me? Or to anyone? If Reed was really doing what you say he was doing, why didn't you ask for help? Calla looked at her aunt, this woman, who'd been like a second mother to her growing up, who'd taught her to bake bread and braid her hair and navigate the social complexities of small-town life. Because every time I tried to ask questions, I was told I was grief-stricken and paranoid. Every time I expressed concern about my mother's estate, I was told I was being disrespectful to Reed's memory of his wife. Every time I pushed back against Lorraine's version of events, I was told I needed to accept that Reed deserved to be happy again. Calla's voice carried 5 years of accumulated hurt and anger. So I stopped asking questions and started finding answers myself. Jody pressed the tissue to her eyes. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. You had every opportunity to have an idea. You just chose to believe what was easier. The words hit Jody like a physical blow. She gathered her things and headed for the door, pausing only to whisper to Reed, "You need to make this right somehow." Then she was gone, leaving only the core of the disaster behind. Della May moved to stand beside Calla, a show of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. "Well," Lorraine said, her voice bright and brittle, "I suppose dinner's ruined." The absurdity of the comment, worrying about pot roast when their entire life was collapsing, might have been funny under other circumstances. But there was nothing funny about the way Reed was staring at the legal notice on the coffee table, or the way Avery was backing toward the kitchen like he wanted to run. "This isn't over," Reed said quietly. "You think you can destroy everything I've built with some papers and recordings? You think you can come back here after 5 years and tear apart my life?" "I'm not tearing apart anything," Calla replied. "I'm just showing people what you built it on." She walked to the front door and opened it, letting cold air sweep into the overheated room. "Enjoy your Christmas dinner," she said. "You've got 90 days to vacate the house, according to the terms of my mother's actual will. I'd start looking for a place to live." 3 months later, Pine Hollow, the town, had taken sides, and Reed was losing badly. Calla sat in the parking lot of the diner on Main Street, watching through the window as Reed and Lorraine ate lunch at a corner table. The same table where Reed used to hold court every Saturday afternoon, surrounded by church board members and town council cronies who hung on his every word. Now they sat alone. They'd aged dramatically since Christmas. Reed's shoulders had a permanent slump now, and his clothes looked too big, like he'd shrunk inside them. The confident posture that had carried him through decades of leadership roles had collapsed into something defensive and uncertain. Lorraine had stopped bothering with the elaborate hairstyles and careful makeup that had been her armor for so many years. Her blonde hair hung limp around her face, and her clothes looked like afterthoughts rather than carefully chosen statements. The other diners kept their distance. Conversations stopped when Reed and Lorraine entered a room, then resumed in whispers after they'd passed. At the grocery store, checkout clerks were coldly professional instead of friendly. The barber shop, where Reed had gotten his hair cut for 15 years, had started booking him at odd hours when fewer people would see him there. Pine Hollow was a small town with a long memory, and financial fraud was bad enough. But doing it to your dead wife's daughter crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The legal proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected. Reed's attorney, a young man from Scranton who specialized in small-town scandals, had advised him to settle rather than go to trial. But Reed's pride wouldn't let him admit guilt publicly, as though they'd fought and they'd lost, and now the whole county knew the details of their crimes. The judge had been particularly harsh in his ruling, using words like egregious breach of trust and systematic exploitation of a vulnerable young woman. The financial manipulation of a grieving daughter had added emotional weight to the legal facts, and the court's judgment reflected that moral dimension. Reed and Lorraine had been ordered to pay full restitution plus interest and penalties, a sum that exceeded $200,000. Their property had gone under lien to secure the judgment. Reed had lost his position on the church board, his spot on the town council, his part-time job keeping books for the mayor's office. But more than that, he'd lost the narrative. For years, he'd been the devoted widower who'd struggled with an ungrateful stepdaughter. Now he was the thief who'd stolen from his dead wife's child and lied about it for half a decade. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Calla's phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. Final judgment entered. House transfer complete. You're officially the owner. Congratulations, she'd won. Completely, totally, without compromise or mercy. The house where she'd grown up was legally hers again. The money that had been stolen was being returned with interest. Reed and Lorene would spend the next decade paying for their crimes. Both financially and socially, why did victory feel so hollow? 6 months later, the cottage Calla wiped sawdust from her hands and stepped back to admire her work. The kitchen cabinets were finally finished solid oak, with hand-carved pulls that matched the ones her mother had always admired in the antique shops they'd visited together. The cottage had been a wreck when she'd bought it back from the investor who'd purchased it after Reed had sold it to pay for Marnie's medical bills. Water damage, neglect, and years of deferred maintenance had left it barely habitable. But it had good bones, and Calla had always been better with her hands than with people. Della May knocked on the screen door and let herself in, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. "Place is looking good," she said, setting the basket on the newly refinished counter. "Starting to feel like home again." Getting there. Calla ran her hand along the cabinet door, feeling for imperfections in the finish. The bedroom's next, then the bathroom. Then maybe I'll tackle the porch. "You've got help if you need it. Silas Kent said he'd donate lumber, and the Morrison boys are looking for summer work." Calla nodded. Word had gotten around town about what she was doing with the cottage. Not everyone supported her war against Reed, but most people respected her skill with woodworking and her willingness to restore something beautiful instead of tearing it down. Any word from Reed and Lorene? They're renting that little apartment above the hardware store. Lorene's working at the flower shop now, and Reed's doing bookkeeping for whoever will hire him. Della May pulled vegetables from the basket and started arranging them in the refrigerator. Avery moved back to his father's place in Scranton. Can't say I blame him. Calla felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt. Avery had been weak and stupid, but he'd also been young and manipulated by his mother. Maybe he didn't deserve to have his life destroyed along with theirs. Then she remembered sleeping in her truck and working 3 jobs while Reed and Lorene spent her inheritance on new cars and kitchen renovations. The guilt flickered and died. Any regrets? Della May asked, like she could read Calla's thoughts. About what? About going nuclear instead of trying to work things out privately. Calla considered the question while she cleaned her tools. Could she have handled things differently? Probably. Could she have gotten the same results without destroying Reed's reputation and Lorene's social standing? Maybe did she care? They had 5 years to work things out, she said finally. 5 years to reach out, to apologize, to try to make things right. Instead, they spent that time hoping I'd disappear and stop being a problem. I just helped them get what they wanted. Della May nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. Just make sure you're building something new, not just tearing down something old. After her cousin left, Calla walked through the cottage, planning her next projects. The place was starting to feel like home again, but it was a different kind of home than she'd known growing up. This one belonged entirely to her, bought with her own money and built with her own hands. She'd started taking in women who needed a place to stay while they figured out their next steps. Maribel Roan, a social worker from the county office, had connected her with 3 women, so far all dealing with family situations that had left them isolated and financially vulnerable. IT wasn't a formal program, just Calla offering her spare bedrooms to people who needed them. But word was spreading through the network of social workers and counselors who dealt with family estrangement and abuse. Maybe Della May was right. Maybe she was building something after all. 1 year later, Christmas morning, Calla woke up on Christmas morning in her mother's cottage, in the bedroom where she'd spent her childhood. Sunlight streamed through the windows she'd repaired and painted, casting warm squares of light across the hardwood floor she'd restored with her own hands. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls instead of the damp and mildew that had greeted her a year ago. The room looked different now than it had when she was growing up. She'd kept some things: the antique dresser her grandmother had painted, the reading chair by the window where her mother used to sit with her morning coffee. But she'd changed others, painting the walls a soft blue instead of the pink her teenage self had chosen. replacing the twin bed with a queen-size one that actually fit her adult frame. IT was still her childhood room, but it belonged to the woman she'd become rather than the girl she'd been. Downstairs, she could hear voices and laughter. Real laughter, not the performed kind that had filled Reed's Christmas dinners. This was the sound of women who'd found something worth celebrating after losing everything they'd thought mattered. Della May was helping Maribel prepare breakfast in the kitchen. Their conversation punctuated by the clink of silverware and the sizzle of bacon in the pan. Two of the women staying at the cottage, Jennifer and Rosa, were decorating a tree they'd cut from the woods behind the house, their voices carrying the kind of easy familiarity that came from shared understanding. It wasn't the Christmas morning Calla had imagined as a child, when she dreamed of having a big family gathered around a perfect tree in a perfect house. But it was better than the Christmas mornings she'd spent alone in her apartment in Asheville, pretending she didn't care about family or tradition or belonging somewhere. This was what belonging looked like when you built it yourself instead of waiting for someone else to invite you in. Her phone rang. Unknown number with a local area code. She almost didn't answer. The past year had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected calls, especially on holidays when people's guilt made them brave enough to reach out. Hello, Calla? This is Avery. She stopped breathing for a moment. She'd wondered if he would call, if the weight of what had happened would eventually drive him to reach out. Part of her had hoped he wouldn't. Part of her had hoped he would. What do you want? I wanted to apologize. I know it's probably too late, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to say it anyway. His voice sounded older than she remembered, worn down by the year he'd spent living with the consequences of his family's actions. Calla walked to the window and looked out at the woods where she and her mother used to collect pine cones and holly branches for Christmas decorations. The trees were bare now, waiting for spring to bring them back to life. Apologize for what, specifically? The question seemed to catch him off guard. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, gathering his thoughts. For knowing what they were doing and not stopping it. For being too much of a coward to tell the truth when it mattered. For believing my mother's version of things because it was easier than admitting she was capable of that kind of cruelty. His voice cracked on the last word, and Calla felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness. She'd learned the difference between understanding someone's pain and excusing their choices. But something like recognition of the complicated ways people betrayed each other and themselves. I was 19 when it started, Avery continued. I thought I was helping my mom build a stable life after years of struggle. She made it sound like you were unstable, like Reed was trying to protect you from yourself. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. That doesn't make it okay. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm sorry. Calla closed her eyes and listened to the laughter from downstairs. Jennifer was telling a story about her first Christmas away from her abusive ex-husband, how strange it felt to wake up without fear. Rosa was planning to call her children later, hoping they'd accept her apology for staying with their father so long. Everyone in this house was trying to rebuild something that had been broken. Everyone was dealing with the aftermath of families that had failed them in different ways. Avery. Yeah. You don't get redemption because you feel guilty. You get it when you take responsibility. You haven't. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Avery spoke again, his voice was smaller, more honest than it had been. What would taking responsibility look like? Calla opened her eyes and stared out at the woods. It was a good question, one she'd been asking herself for the past year. What did accountability look like when the damage was already done? What did healing look like when forgiveness wasn't possible or even desired? I don't know, she said finally, but it starts with admitting what you did without making excuses for why you did it. And it continues with figuring out how to live with the consequences instead of asking other people to make you feel better about them. Okay, Avery said quietly. I'll try to do that. She hung up and deleted his number from her phone. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some conversations needed to happen only once. Downstairs, Della May was setting the table with mismatched plates and silverware that Calla had collected from thrift shops and estate sales. It looked nothing like the formal Christmas dinners Reed had hosted, with matching china and carefully arranged place cards that assigned everyone their proper place in his version of family hierarchy. This table was made for people who'd learned to create their own places in the world. Who was on the phone? Maribel asked, carrying a platter of bacon to the table. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who'd spent 30 years helping families navigate crisis and trauma. She understood better than most that sometimes the healthiest choice was to walk away from people who couldn't stop hurting you. Nobody important. Jennifer looked up from the crossword puzzle she was working on, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. My ex used to call on holidays, trying to make me feel guilty for leaving. Some people can't stand it when you stop caring about their opinion. Did you ever stop caring? Rosa asked, setting down her coffee cup. Really, completely? Jennifer considered the question, tapping her pen against the table. She was in her 50s, with graying brown hair and laugh lines that had deepened since she'd left her marriage. Moving into the cottage had given her time to remember who she'd been before. 20 years of walking on eggshells had taught her to make herself smaller. I stopped caring about getting him to understand why I left. I stopped caring about his approval or his forgiveness. But I don't think I'll ever stop caring that it happened, you know? The betrayal becomes part of your story, whether you want it there or not. But you get to decide what role it plays in the rest of your story, Rosa added. She was younger than Jennifer, barely 30, but domestic violence and family estrangement had aged her in ways that showed in her careful way of moving through the world. Whether it's the thing that defines you or just the thing that taught you who you really are. Calla poured herself coffee and sat down at the table. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from chimneys throughout the valley. Other families having their own Christmas mornings, dealing with their own complicated histories of love and betrayal and forgiveness. Some of those families would find ways to heal together. Some would learn to love each other despite their failures and mistakes. Some would create new traditions that honored both their past and their present. And some, like hers, would learn that the healthiest choice was to build something entirely new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Not every family is blood, she said, raising her coffee mug toward the women gathered around her makeshift table. But every betrayal leaves a scar. I didn't erase mine. I made it part of the design. The women around the table raised their own mugs in response. They understood about scars and survival and building new families from the wreckage of old ones. They knew the difference between forgiveness and healing, between letting go and giving up. They knew that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to pretend that betrayal was love. Outside, snow began to fall on the cottage that Calla had restored with her own hands, using money that was rightfully hers. In a life she'd built from nothing, after losing everything that had mattered to the girl she used to be. It was a good Christmas morning. Different from what she'd imagined, harder one than what she'd hoped for, but hers in a way that nothing had ever been before. And that was enough.